So, welcome to the final panel of Sweden Game Conference. And as you all very well know, the theme of the conference was politics and games, and I should get my slide up, right? Sorry. Sorry. Yep. So reflections on power play and changing perspectives. And since this is the final panel, I want to welcome Haydn from gamesindustry.biz. Jean, who just taught us about narrative. Elie, who questioned the romance in games. Emily, who told us a telltale story. And Aleksander, who showed us the nuts and bolts of programming Frostpunk. And how this panel will take place is I have a few questions for the panelists. And then I will take questions from the public, and you can tweet your questions at my Twitter account, okay? Just tweet @Sarian and ask the question, okay? I will try to get as many of them as possible. Okay, let's begin. So, how did you feel about the conference, and what's the takeaway from it overall? You can start, Aleksander.
Contestant number one, okay. So for me, this conference is mainly meeting people and listening to fine lectures. And what I would take from that is that Sweden has a lot of really good people that can do games and can understand games very, very well. And they are worthwhile. So that's the output of the conference for me.
So I've loved being at this conference. I'm so glad all of you brought me here. I'd never been to Skövde before, and the last time I was in Sweden was 9 years ago. So I've been really, really impressed by how excited everyone is about games and how open to talking about different topics in games everyone has been. This has just been a really good experience. I feel like I've learned a lot from all of you, and I'm really thankful to have been here.
I come to Sweden semi-frequently for games work, but this was my first time also coming to Sweden Game Conference. And it was also one of the talk that I gave on romance was extremely important and personal for me. I often get asked to come give technical talks or talk about careers, and I have a lot of things to say about, you know, becoming a game dev and imposter syndrome, but getting to speak about something that I felt was so personal and political, and to get the response and the support that I got from people here was so, it was just such a beautiful and warm thing to experience and realize that the values that I'm trying to preach about were being echoed by everybody, all the attendees, all the players, all the devs, and that was super exciting for me. Not only that, but I made a lot of really amazing friends at this conference, and I'm looking forward to come back and do it again.
I haven't seen much of a conference because I've landed yesterday, but it's not my first time. I've been to SGC 2 years ago, and I've sent another person from Russia last year, Kirill Zolovkin. It was me. But yeah, SGC has always been for me mostly the academic exchange of knowledge between people, just finding friendship, and so far, even with this less than 24 hours, it delivered perfectly. And it's still a party, it will deliver more.
So this is my first time in Sweden, and really enjoyed the conference so far, well, the whole thing. And I'm really new to the games industry. I've only been sort of working as a journalist in the industry for a little over a year now, and it's really exciting to be able to come to somewhere like this where politics and games and the intersection therein is discussed so openly, I think especially during a time when global politics feels like it's sort of spiraling madly out of control. So it's really reassuring to come to a conference like this and see it discussed in sort of, you know, without judgment and just taking a really sort of thorough, like objective approach to, you know, how these things work, because it's something that affects all of us, like, you know, personally and in our careers as well. So.
Thank you. So everything we do is political. What do you think about this statement? Who wants to jump in first?
I'll bite the bullet. I want to mention Tolkien for a while, like from a writer's perspective. Generally, this will be a pattern from me. But Tolkien always said that he abhorred allegory and comparison of Lord of the Rings and Middle Earth in general as being allegory for the real world. However, he still used a lot of reality to inspire the world and as such support the world there was and at some point anticipate, as in there was an we have called Russia for a while Eastern Mordor, and there was a reason mostly that just like it was represented this way, and Tolkien could not anticipate at that point the Cold War, because I think it by date it just doesn't work specifically, and he actually used for Russia Dale as a starting point. But even though he did not aim to do anything political, he still represented, he still put a lot of stuff that he already knew, his biases, all of his situation into this particular work. And even if we don't try to do anything political, we still are people that are affected by culture, and we create stuff that somehow represent this culture or is influenced by it. And there is just no point in denying that, or even calling like a game political or apolitical. It just is this way. It will propagate certain ideas, it will support certain ideas, or it will break them specifically if it's designed this way, in certain ways.
I'll jump in after that. So I'm American. I live in the United States. I'm from the United States. And there's a lot of political stuff going on in my country right now. And it's becoming, as an American, increasingly difficult for anyone to say that they are apolitical or that they don't take a stance on different issues because, not to be overly dramatic, but people's lives and livelihoods are literally at stake in a lot of the political discussions happening right now. Racism, like overt racism, is at a huge high in the United States. A lot of people are being deported. There are a lot of discussions about LGBTQ, women's rights, that everyone thought were kind of done discussions that are being brought back up and questioned again. And it's difficult to say that you're apolitical because the people you know in your life who might be losing some of what they had become comfortable with as rights see that and see, I guess you don't care about me. Like, you're not willing to fight for me to continue to have the life I have now. And I think that's been very reflected in a lot of the discourse about video games and politics in the United States. And yeah, it's just very difficult for me to get out of my mind, not even going into part of what I talked about in my talk, which will probably come up in this panel. Workers' rights in the US are not great, especially compared to many of the more socialist countries in Europe, and that's a discussion in our games industry that is starting to happen, and I hope happens more. So yeah, I think everything is inherently political, and if you think you're not being political, you're either suffering from a lack of understanding your own bias, or you're not even at the point where you can ask that question.
Definitely going to agree with what Emily just said about how everything you do is inherently political, which is why whenever you hear some organization be like, we're going to leave politics at the door. No, you're not. It's not even possible. You saying we're going to leave politics at the door is a political statement on its own, whether you realize it or not. Politics is really so deeply woven into everything that we do. Even fashion is political. And this is something I experience a lot, especially someone as a non-binary person who's very vibrantly queer presenting. And you can imagine I get stared at for wearing makeup. I get stared at for the kinds of clothes I wear. How is that not political? Like, why would people not be staring at me if there wasn't weight in my decision, even just to present myself like that? So when you're presenting news, when you're making art, when you're doing any of those things, all of those biases, all of those opinions, they show themselves one way or another, whether you want them to. Your decision to include or exclude anything is a statement on its own. So if you're going to say, like, we're going to leave politics at the door, you just made a political statement right there and then.
Do you want to jump in?
I think that if we want to consider games as an art form, and I think we all do, we all have to keep in mind that art is always, at some point, political, because it's, in the first place, it can be used by politics like a tool for their agenda, which is not really what artists wanted in the first place, but it just happens. So there is no way we could avoid being political while making art or any like media products. So yeah, everything we do is political, whether we want it or not, just like my predecessor said.
It's amazing how much like the work we do will reflect itself in the real world in very concrete ways. Like maybe some of you are familiar, I know this is kind of a funny anecdote, but maybe some of you are familiar with the fact that there was a Rick and Morty episode that made the fans go crazy over like the Szechuan sauce, but then they started like actually like, I don't know, they weren't like rioting over it or whatever, but they weren't getting like violent and aggressive, and they were, I don't know, just protesting in social media or at actual McDonald's or whatever. And it's crazy that you could make a cartoon that has this like, it was barely even a joke, you know, it was just like a line in the show, and people went nuts over it in the real world, so much they were even inspired to get violent. So we have to consider, when we say, rather what I would like to say is, when we're saying that we're gonna leave politics at the door, whoever, whatever idiot says that, sorry, like that is wildly irresponsible. It is incredible that you're not gonna acknowledge the weight of your work, your decisions, whatever it is that you do. Haydn, you've been a little quiet. Yeah, maybe you want to jump in here. Like,
sort of speaking to that in particular, you know, in the context of journalism in this industry as well, I think it's especially important, you know, the role of journalists, even in something like games media, which some people may be a bit dismissive of as not being that important, but it's still, there are people who need holding to account within this industry. And if you look at things like what have happened with Telltale recently and Rockstar and things like that, that is all political, you know, that's things like workers' rights. And especially when you look at that in the context of how bad workers' rights are in America, and how in Europe they're obviously a lot better, but then you have, you know, the UK pulling out of the European Union, putting workers' rights potentially at risk. And this is all just in the games industry. And I think it's important for journalists, even just in the games industry, to actually approach these issues and cover them in a way that is like responsible as well, rather than, you know, clickbait headlines, anything like that, you know, actually going out and citing sources and speaking to the people involved. And I think it's something which can get left at the door, and it's something which we really need to focus on increasingly as people's rights are being put at risk more and more.
could you actually maybe say something about like how, because we're all talking here about making art, but journalism is kind of, in some ways, it's almost like on the front line of like these things actually happening.
So would you elaborate a little bit?
Yeah, well, basically, I mean, obviously, we're saying here that everything you do is political. But it's really difficult to argue, for example, like journalism isn't political. Like this is one of those, it's like we come to journalism to you know, yeah, some people might say video games aren't political, they're just games or whatever, but nobody's saying that about journalism. And I guess my point is just like, do you feel like someone who's working as a journalist, like, do you ever feel like there's like a spotlight on you to be more responsible about that? Like you specifically even, or like your colleagues are like, oh crap, we gotta be political and we gotta do it right, you know, or something like.
Well, one thing I would say is I think I'm quite uncommon for a lot of journalists in the industry in that I've come up from working as a regional journalist, where even though you're writing about flower shows or council budgets, there is still a very particularly high standard in the way that things need to be done, and there is a lot of rigor, even at the lowest levels. And I think games journalism can.
What do you mean by high standards? Sorry.
Even games journalists, because it's very much, it's a lot of people who are enthusiastic, a lot of sort of blogs and things that are started up by people who just want to write about games. Some of the sort of due process can get left behind And that's obviously really problematic when you're covering things like, say the Telltale closure or Rockstar, where these are people's lives, and sometimes things aren't being verified, they're not being discussed properly, and like you say, it is obviously political, and I think we have a duty as journalists to cover it in the most sort of rigorous and well-defined and thought-out way possible.
I would just like to say that he did a write-up on my talk the other day, and it was really good. So thank you so much for
for
doing that due process.
But it wasn't political.
Well, it was. No, it was quite political. Which kind of brings me to another point that I meant to mention when you asked me about my takeaways from this conference. So I touched on this briefly in my talk the other day, but during my talk, I brought up the idea of maybe we should kind of sort of consider perhaps, I don't know, talking about, well, I guess a union or something. And I wasn't quite that waffly about it, but I was still pretty waffly. And
Say waffly again.
Waffly. But, once again, being from the United States, saying we should start a union, which, by the way, we should start a union, is a really scary thing to say. And I intentionally didn't give this talk in the US. I wanted to come talk to an audience and hopefully journalists who would be a little bit more sympathetic and understanding to what happened, and we're seeing things through a bit of a different lens, and that totally worked. The audience was very receptive. I'm seeing a lot of you are smiling now as I'm talking about it, that we need better workers' rights in the game industry, especially in the United States, but across the whole industry. So thank you for giving me a platform to do that and for supporting us and, having solidarity even from another country really far away.
But actually, I want to jump in as well. When it comes to these kind of subjects, of course, what happens in the industry and a telltale, that's a hard piece to write about. But as a journalist, Haydn, would you see yourself in a position of looking at games from these perspectives? Looking at games as political products, like trying to figure out the view of the developer and how the world is portrayed, and do you analyze it?
I do agree that games are just political inherently. I think that whenever you could even argue that Candy Crush is political, if you tried hard enough. And I wouldn't fight you on it. But I think from the perspective of a journalist, it's more my position to report what is there rather than to kind of put myself into the story and give my view of what is there. And I think there are plenty of people in the industry who can do that and who are well equipped to do that. But I see myself more as as a typical sort of reporter. I go find the story and then I tell everyone what the story is. And that will always kind of unfortunately be informed by my own sort of personal biases, no matter what I may try. Emily's comments on the union, I made sure to include them and give them good space because it's something which needs discussing. And there are plenty of other journalists who sort of washed over that or didn't feel that it was relevant to their audience. So again, that's political. So like I say, from the perspective of a journalist, it's my bias will always inform, but I will always try and remove myself from it in order to present the story as it is rather than what I want the story to be.
Aleksander, do you have any interesting stories about making the kind of games that you are making? Who makes people very, very sad, maybe?
Whoa. Okay, so first of all, we made a game that was clearly had a political statement. It was This War of Mine, and it was anti-war agenda, really. But what we wanted to do was not really make some kind of political game, but just to show that the games can pick up difficult topics, and being a civilian at war is a very difficult topic. And whether we succeeded or not, we released the game, and then there was a situation in Ukraine, and we were accused that we are using the bad situation there for our game as an advantage, which was simply not true because we started developing this War of Mine 2 years earlier. So before that crisis happened there, so we had no idea that that would come out, and there was some kind of hard decision: release the game and just go with it, or wait for the situation to resolve. And that was, we were considering, seriously considering that, but all in all, we had to release the game just to make the company go further. And thankfully, through many journalists opposed the idea that the game is feasting on some kind of crisis in Ukraine, some kind of situation there. So even when you release a game that has strong political view on some subjects, it can be politically connected with some other things, but thankfully it didn't backlash on us that much, and the message was delivered. Maybe it was the game, maybe it was just the conscious journalism that followed the product itself. Yeah.
There was to follow up. Oops, shit! I'm following up Ukraine. Oh, sorry. No, following up with there is a concept in film studies called death of the author, as in the text is supposed to be understood without taking the author in mind. And in terms of video games, whatever we are doing can be used in every way. Like what you said with backlash with the Ukraine situation, and probably the most common example is all the politicians saying video games are making people violent. This was not created with this political statement in mind, but it was used later for a certain political agenda specifically, and because the spin was put on specific situation. Although, of course, we can't control that, but it's just something that can be happening. The game, once it's out, nobody can, well, technically they can ask us what we were meaning, but we can't just go to every player and say, we meant this, we didn't mean this. People will understand the text how they want it to be understood.
So on that note, before I worked at Telltale, I worked at a serious games company called Cognito, and we made conversation simulator trainings for doctors, for teenagers to learn to talk to each other about depression, and one of the products I worked on there was called Together Strong. And we were actually commissioned by the US VA, the Veterans Affairs, to make this game for veterans of the US military who had returned home from war and from the service, to learn to talk to one another about issues that they dealt with coming home. And we really went into it. We talked about, reintegrating into your family, dealing with financial situations coming back home, PTSD, and even suicidal ideation. And there's a point in one of the conversations where the character you're playing as is talking to his friend, and you find out that your friend has been really seriously considering suicide, and he has a handgun in his home. And this is a product that people were going to be playing to learn how to have this kind of conversation in their real life, because veteran suicide is a really big issue in the United States. It's unfortunately really common. So the standard we had to hit in designing and writing that conversation was so high, because we knew people playing this were going to go and try to do it in real life, and that real people's lives were on the line there. So trying to come up with like a piece of display text when you know the person clicking on it is probably going to try and say that to an actual suicidal person, there's a lot of pressure there. Which I think is good. Like, that's an enormous amount of responsibility. But we don't think about that necessarily in the context of making fictional games. Like, that was a serious game meant to instruct something, but fictional games deal with similar types of subject matter all of the time. And I think a lot of writers try their best to do it, but like, for example, at Cognito, we were working with about a dozen subject matter experts and psychologists to make sure we did it really, really right. And I've never seen like a AAA or an indie game company try and do that amount of due diligence. And I don't know if they necessarily need to. Like, we were going, once again, really, really hard on that, trying to be very specific. But that's how much your work matters. Because even if someone's picking up a fun story game that they're intending to just chill out with for a few hours, if you model for them a conversation like that or a type of really serious moment, they're going to learn something from it. And their takeaway might be, well, this worked in the video game, this might work for me in real life. So as a video game developer, you have a responsibility to your players to, if you're dealing with really serious subject matter, be it political or medical, anything like that, do it as properly as you possibly can.
Completely agree with that. Like, just nailed it right there. It actually made me think about Senua's Sacrifice, Hellblade, or whatever its real lame name was. But Senua's Sacrifice, how in the beginning of the game, they actually say how they tried to model a lot of the experience of the character after the actual experience of psychosis. And they even wrote in the beginning something like that they contacted many people who actually had the experience and professionals who deal with people who've had the experience of psychosis. And when you read that as a player, you actually have this moment of like, oh, like now it's legit. And I don't know why you wouldn't want to have that in your game. So if you're writing, like you said, we're dealing with these similar types of topics even in our fantasy games all the time, and they're very applicable to our real world lives. Why wouldn't we want to hire subject matter experts who are going to come onto the project? And then you can even say that in the beginning of the game and have that moment and your players go like, wow, they really did their homework. Wow, they really tried to do this. We actually appreciate that. We think that's a good thing. We think that's cool in our games. When we do that homework, when we take it seriously, and when those games are applicable to our lives, when they are relatable in that way, when we see ourselves in our media, they speak to us even more. And that's a lot of what I was trying to say with my romance talk, actually.
I'll tail end from the propaganda conversation. What you have just described is essentially creating a credible source for what you are doing. This is one of the principles of propaganda, and people like just trust more to the situation. It gives you credibility.
I think we already started to touch a little bit on the last question that I will ask now, and then I'm going to start reading questions from Twitter, which is...
Laura, before you continue, I want to commend you because I think this is the first panel that I have seen in a long time where nobody is from the same country.
Oh, yeah.
Like, we're all from different countries.
We should maybe say what countries we are from. So, Aleksander, you are from Poland, right?
Yes, I'm from Poland.
Then we have the US, right?
Yeah.
Elie?
I am from Finland. Yeah. And I know my English sounds American, but I'm not sorry that my English is better than yours.
I'm his neighbor. I'm from St. Petersburg, Russia. But I live in Germany.
And I'm from the UK, which probably will stop existing after Brexit.
And I'm originally from Romania. And on a scale from 1 to 10, how much does this matter to you? Because to me, I'm having trouble identifying myself with a certain nationality, and I think it's about time to go past that concept. But maybe that's just me.
Well, then retire, please, all the Russian villains.
Like the question that I was trying to put is, does that being Polish or American or Finnish or Russian or English or Romanian defines you?
So I think that I had a very unconventional upbringing on this front, especially in the time in which I had it. And my life was spread between... So I have a very complicated background, and sometimes when people ask me about my background, I like to just say Nordic and Middle Eastern because it makes it easy for me to kind of jump through some very complicated hoops, where I spent a lot of my life in America because of my father's business. My mother, she's actually from the city I live in now, in Helsinki, and my father is actually he would tell you that he's Israeli, but he was born in Baghdad. And I did one of those DNA tests that told me I was 48% Iraqi. And to be like, yeah, thank you. To be an Israeli Arab, that's pretty complicated, you can imagine. And then to have been raised by my father, so my father's Jewish, and you have to realize that Arab Jews are not allowed to exist. Like socially, that's not allowed. You have to pick one. And so they were like, well, we're Jewish. So they all, the 11 of them fled to Israel, and then they were like, I guess we're not Arabs then. That's a thing they had to do. And I respect my father if he wants to say that his identity is that he is Israeli, but I don't think he gets to take away me being Iraqi or whatever, especially because I don't really buy into that idea that you have to be one or the other. But that dynamic does actually exist. And so for me, it was very complicated to be Israeli and Iraqi and Finnish and spend so much time my entire life in Israel, but not Iraq, in Finland, and in America. And when I was in America, to also be in a bubble such that I was quite old by the time I realized how international I was, or whatever. And I used to have a very heavy accent when I spoke English. I sounded very Middle Eastern, so that's the thing that changed over time. And I realized people's perception of me started to change based on things like that, often very superficial things. When I went to university in the States, and then out straight after graduating, moved to Helsinki, and I got paler. And it's funny, but so in my head I was thinking oh, do I pass as white now? Because while I was living in the US, people would often be like, oh, you're Mexican. And sorry, but that's the reality.
I know.
Yeah, I was dealing with a lot of that. And then I thought maybe it would be a little different when I went to Finland, but I was still not white enough or whatever. And so I very regularly have strangers come up to me and be like, excuse me, do you speak Finnish? That's their opening question. So for me, when I say I'm from Finland, it feels similar to my gender, where I'm I identify as, because I feel to find some kind of grounding, because apparently your nationality is very important to so many people, and they identify that, oh yeah, Russians are so, Finns are so, blah, and all these kinds of things. Or they try to get a background in their head, a foundation for who you are as a person. So I kind of felt like I needed that as well. And I felt the most safe in myself in Finland. So oftentimes people ask me, and I don't even go into my background, I just say I'm Finnish. And then I get, but where are you from originally? I get that whole racist thing. So to sum all that up, my point is that it's so complicated that I'm really interested to hear if other people are no, being Polish is important to me, But for me, I'm I identify as Finnish, and I hope you treat me accordingly. That's what I'm trying to do, but it's very complicated, and I almost wish we just lived in a world where we didn't think about ethnicities and nationalities in the ways that we do. I don't want it to be important, but it is, so I'm trying to have one.
And reflects a lot in games as well, right? And how everyone portrays people in games.
I actually, for me, St. Petersburg, we have certain pride in our small birthplace, and we hate Moscow. And because it's a garbage city made out of pressed dust. Take no prisoners! What? That escalated quickly.
You went for blood.
Trust me, if you spend with me 5 minutes, I will definitely say fuck Moscow at some point. But being born in, technically I was born a Soviet citizen in 1989. So my formational years are, there is no country. There is from one side, America sponsors all the entertainment. There is entertainment from the Soviet Union that is supposedly anti that. So you're just between those clashing situations. At which point you either choose this particular identity or you just reject it entirely and completely. And even if you are moving forward, is just no longer is not applicable, but just one of them is fucked up, the other one is fucked up, and this is the only place of proper identity that I actually really have at this point. Is just I'm from St. Petersburg. I usually if you ask me where I'm from, I say I'm from St. Petersburg, and then not I'm from Russia or something, and mostly so that you don't think that I'm from Moscow. But and in writing, a lot of time I've seen that this particular the identity of being from St. Petersburg and the experience that I had growing up in St. Petersburg, especially in the 90s, and being mugged a lot. In a couple of games, I have had a lot of comments regarding are you writing St. Petersburg in the 90s? And then I realized, yeah, I kind of do. And it eventually bled out, even though I completely did not notice that. It just bled through the cracks. Plus, the way I speak in Russian is sort of street slang with a dash of pretentiousness, which actually translates a lot. Not direction, but the style specifically translates a lot into English. Like I would still say the word "fuck" a lot, but I will also say the words like vernacular and and eloquence and so on and so on, just to be a little bit more pretentious. And it bleeds a lot, and there's identity part is also extremely important, but in regards of our cooperation, which is why I wanted to comment, is basically because I think my country had some beef with almost everybody on this panel at some extent, and to me it's very important that all of those different nationalities, yes, cool. We have always been cool. Because we exchange ideas and we see what other people are or who they are, and that this identity does not necessarily is not like the only label that you can put on a person, like oh, he's Finnish, he's only Finnish, oh, he's Polish, he's only Polish, and so on, which is usually how it is portrayed. Regardless, like people are just completely irrelevant for this perspective. Like it's usually American government, while they mean by America, they usually mean American government, not American people, by Finnish government, and so on and so on. But I lost my train of thought. I will stop.
So I was called out to, being Polish is important for me. But I think that the question was, does the nationality define us? It doesn't. It has an impact on us, but it doesn't define us. And what defines us, I think, is our actions, our views, our opinions, and we forge them based on our own experiences, and our own experiences are strictly connected to the cultural region, to the nationality, to the place where you have been, where you grow up, and that defines us in some way, but not the nationality. And if someone is proud of being from one nation, and that's the only thing that he can be proud of, then he didn't do well in life, because people tend to be proud of their deeds and not just the places where they were born. So it is important, but more important is what we do with what we were given.
So what you mean is that the games we make define us, right?
I think that yes, because when I came here and I'm wearing a T-shirt from my game, and everyone, oh, you made Frostpunk, and yeah. So if I weren't wearing that T-shirt, probably nobody would notice me. So yes, to some extent, yes. But this applies not only to our games, but like everything we do with our life. So it's like the perception of our persona or ourselves by the rest of the people.
Do you have anything to add?
The one thing I sort of want to say is, like you say, nationality, I think, or nationalism can be kind of quite a scary thing when you use that to measure your self-worth over sort of your deeds and your actions. And it's something which, without wanting to dwell on Brexit more, but that's the sort of attitude that leads to things like Brexit, this over-focus on nationalism rather than who we are and what we can achieve. And that runs a very real risk of kind of unpicking and pulling apart this European institution that has overseen like the longest period of peace in Europe in written history. And it's all because people in the UK are scared of foreigners. And that all comes down to nationalism, sort of rampant nationalism. So being British doesn't define me. I mean, really, I'm Welsh, but I'm middle class, so everyone thinks I sound English. So the way I see it, culturally, I'm European, I guess.
Yeah, talking about nationalism as an American is always really weird because it's a very, very nationalistic country, but it's also a super diverse country. Like, I'll be perfectly honest, being in Sweden for the past few days, I don't think I've been around this many white people in a really long time. It's kind of making me uncomfortable. I'm not used to it.
I feel that.
It's not the way my world looks, living in the US, but at the same time, like growing up in the United States, as a student in every kind of school, public schools, religious schools, private schools, all of them, you have to stand and pledge to the flag every single day of your entire education. So a lot of Americans think like our politics doesn't necessarily affect our art, but I think a big part of that is because we also see our art as the default. Like we don't get a whole lot of imported art from other countries. We get more from Europe than a lot of the rest of the world, but it's still not all that much. And I think a lot of us don't realize how much of the default we are. But even that default doesn't really exist. Like I was just talking to Laura the other day. So many like American TV shows and stuff are set in American high schools, and most of them have an outdoor type setup, people walking in between classes, having a long time to get there, wearing funky hats in school. None of that exists. Like most American high schools are like 4-story buildings in one corner of town. There's no outside area. You can't wear hats in American high schools. Like that kind of vision of what the American default is isn't even what the country looks like, but then we keep putting it in our art, and that's really odd.
Actually, in Helsinki, people ask me all the time because they know that I spend so much time in America. They'll be like, so in America, do they really have those parties with the red cups?
Okay, we do have the red cups. That is a real thing.
That's a real thing. Here's another real thing, and I was super sad when I had to answer this one. They're like, all right, is this just a thing on TV and like movies? Or do Americans actually sue each other that much?
We do.
Also real.
But I mean, there are so many other things too, like, and the United States is an enormous country with a ton of different cultures and a lot of cultural diversity, even among like white people in different regions. Like people will look at the United States and talk about your cars and your trucks and that kind of thing, but I lived my late teens and my early 20s in New York City and didn't own a car for 8 years. You know what I mean? It depends where you are, but what's scary is that default that doesn't really exist, that is affecting most of the art we put out into the world, and we're saying something with that. We're saying this is what we aspire to, this is what everybody else should aspire to, and it's not real.
Y'all know, you're from Sweden, y'all know Yang Lean? Yeah, I heard some chuckles. I read this article about this guy in which he talked about the first time he came to America, and he was like, it just felt like it didn't count. Like we just got there and none of it was real, especially because of the image that like of America that's pumped into media versus what the reality actually is. But the cups are there.
I'm going to start taking some questions from Twitter. Now we don't have that much time left. Jonathan is asking, games as overt components in an election campaign. Why not, and how would you use it to get Princess Peach elected? Who wants to take that?
So there are actual tools of propaganda to do that. I will jump on my talk again. But actually there was a game that, in the British game, what is it called?
Not Tonight?
Not Tonight, yeah, specifically that was criticizing Brexit and painting the picture of what would happen with, and it's bleak as hell, and I'm Russian. No. And this is actually like, it's kind of the same approach can be used in this regard to smear an opponent or to promote your specific situation. In case of Princess Peach being the queen, essentially, of the tyrannical government, it will be kind of in the same way, just to promote this particular persona and to do the credibility and to, like, make the events in this situation. Because in the game, you sort of providing the 8-10 hours of experience with which you can create events, which are also the tools of propaganda. Like the proper propaganda does not do with lies, actually. It just makes a certain spin on events and creates certain events. In this regard, it... sorry, I'm kind of passing out the lights. Sorry.
So one thing, if you don't mind me sort of butting in there a little bit, is that there is there is actually in the UK there is a games company called Games for the Many, which is part funded by the Labour opposition party. and they made a game called Corbyn Run, which was a game about the leader of the Labour Party chasing down the Prime Minister in her like gold-plated helicopter or whatever it was. But they're actually making games specifically funded by the Labour Party to put forward the Labour message. So Corbyn Run was the first one. It was downloaded and played hundreds of thousands of times, and they are currently working on other projects at the moment, and they do game jams and all sorts of stuff. So there is definitely a scope for it, and it's interesting how sort of the left-leaning party in the UK sees that there is potential, and they are getting on this and jumping on this.
It's fantastic that you mentioned game jams too, because jams allow you to make these like real quick games that last like for as long as it took to make them, essentially. Like you can't now start developing like some AAA level game that discusses the situation in a political situation in America right now. I mean, obviously you can, but my point is that if you're going to start quoting all this like specific stuff, if your like game is trying to be like memey in some way, that needs to like come out as fast as it happened, essentially. And it's really cool how game jams are an opportunity to make games that will do that. You know, it's like, you know what I saw in the news last week, you jam on it over the weekend, the game comes out and people can talk about it in a way that you can't really do with all these fully fledged games, because they take so long to make that you were so far from that point once they've actually come out.
It's actually jumping on the game jams.
I want to take more Twitter questions.
Okay.
Yes, I'm
But
sorry.
let's add with sad though. You can't elect Princess Peach because everybody knows she's in another castle.
Anyways, buddy.
So, actually, I want to ask you, Aleksander, do you consider yourself a feminist?
Oh my God.
It's not me, it's Tove.
Well, it depends how do you define feminism, because I think that the word's meaning differs among the people who asks. So I don't think I feel good like speaking about that. I would say that I feel feminist, but if you want to discuss that with me, I would prefer to do it like one-to-one discussion about what do you mean by that. So my answer would be yes, but let's talk about that. What is the meaning of the word for the...
It's a particularly heated word in Poland, so respect for you not just saying pass to that question.
Well, I'm not defined by being Polish.
No, you can totally, if some of the questions are heavy, you can say pass, like in the narrative panel. And I forgot to mention that at the beginning of this. I have another question from Josephine. What political question is most important for you right now? Who wants to go first? Emily? I think, is it?
I'm completely overwhelmed by that question, to be perfectly honest. There's so many. Yeah, I don't know.
Okay.
Sorry.
Can I just say, in the context of the games industry, I would say it's workers' rights. That's the thing that's the most important, and it's unionizing potentially, or whatever sort of avenue it is we decide to go down with it. That is the thing that is the most important in the context of games. Outside of games, I don't know, pending nuclear annihilation, like it's a difficult one. Like global warming, climate change, racism. I think there is so many sort of terrifying issues facing us at the moment. It's hard to really pick one to focus on.
Yeah, I thought of my answer while you were saying that. So, I mean, my gut reaction was probably saying workers' rights, but then I got overwhelmed by lots of other American things. And one of them is healthcare. I mean, like, I don't have health insurance right now. If I step off the plane in America and fall down and hurt myself, it's probably going to cost me $50,000. You know what I mean? And I'm never going to be able to pay that back, and my life will be ruined. And that's just part of the reality of living in the country I live in right now, unfortunately, and I really feel like that should not be a thing. Like, I would love for the United States to have some manner of socialized healthcare. That would be really cool.
So I live in Finland. Healthcare is all good. There are so many things I want to say to this question, so many things that are really important, but the thing that keeps me up at night the most, like I just feel my heart racing just thinking about it right now, is everything surrounding the Me Too movement.
I'm going to say that it's the elimination of the us versus them mentality, which is nothing but hurtful.
Next question. Do you think a game can be too preachy or political?
Definitely. I will say this is the problem of exposition in general and propaganda in general. If you do it in somebody's face, then they will just reject that, and there is the concept of backfire effect. Essentially, if you tell somebody they are wrong, even though you present the facts and stuff like that, they will just double down. And actually, the best example in this is South Park episode of Double Down, which actually, in a very metaphorical and allegorical way, deals with former Trump supporters, as in essentially mocking them. And they just double down on that. So whenever it's too preachy, there is a huge chance that it will just not land. The same way that if you do the wall of text of exposition, nobody will read it ever. Or they can even react to it a complete opposite way. It has to be, it just doesn't work.
Absolutely, so please be responsible when you make your games. That's the thing I really, really wanted to say. It's unfortunately so real that we can scare people away with a message by how the message is relayed.
Just a little bit of follow-up to this. It also can for starters, if this is by accident, you don't control it, and hence it just goes out of the way and can be used in whichever way possible. You can no longer have control on this situation, and it can be used by the other side to take people and take this particular message that doesn't work and to preach and to essentially this is how one of the anti-SJW arguments usually work. As in, this is too preachy or something like that, and nobody likes people who are being too preachy. And yeah.
Any thoughts from the press on this side?
I mean, I think you guys have kind of said mostly what needs to be said, but I think in terms of with being too preachy, I think the thing that people hate perhaps more than anything else is being wrong and being told that they're wrong, ultimately.
This is the backfire effect,
yes. So it's the only way to kind of promote change in a way that actually works is for people to come to that conclusion themselves, and you can help them by sort of pushing them in the right direction or showing them different ideas they perhaps haven't considered, but no one likes to be told that they are wrong. So it takes a huge amount of sort of like self-assuredness to be told that you're wrong and actually accept that. And I think a lot of people really struggle with that idea.
Especially when you think you're right, you know? It's like, oh, I'm right about this thing. Hey, by the way, you're wrong about that thing. No, I'm not. Like, why would you immediately go like, huh? It's actually quite difficult for that to be, you have to like practice having that reaction, essentially.
The other thing is, if your game or any piece of art is too overtly creating one political message, people who disagree with you won't engage with it. They're not going to play it. So before I got into the games industry, I mentioned this in the narrative panel earlier, I went to university for acting. That's what my undergraduate degree is in. And a lot of the people I went to acting school with and a lot of my professors were very, very into political theater at the time. And those kinds of plays would generally be put on in very, very small venues in New York. Usually the cast was unpaid, also not great. And pretty much everyone who came to see it already completely agreed with the message. And people who didn't agree with it, like the posters, like really, really obviously said what the play was going to be about. They wouldn't buy tickets to go see that. Same thing with a game. Like they might mock the front page of the game, the main menu, or mock some videos that they see online, but they're not going to buy it. So I think there's a lot to be said for making games like that as therapy or as a way to cope. I'm not saying don't make an incredibly political, very, very overt game. There are a lot of good reasons to do that. Game jams are a wonderful place to make them. But if you're coming at it trying to change people's minds, know that you probably shouldn't have to, but you're probably going to have to put it in a little bit more of a digestible wrapper and start to bring in the message a little bit more slowly in a way that the person can understand.
Okay, and I think I'm going to take the last question. So I have a question from Lara, and she asks, as a Kurdish girl from Iraq, celebrating my nationality has been pretty much forbidden. Coming to Sweden has offered me a freedom to finally do that, but I'm also required to fit into the society and culture. Is the game industry any different in terms of fitting in? It's a very good question.
Give me a mic real fast. Yeah! Like, oh my goodness, I cannot even begin. So this year I was on Train Jam. For everyone who doesn't know what it is, it's a game jam that takes place on a train, surprise. And it goes from Chicago to Emeryville, right outside of San Francisco, just 2 days before GDC starts. So the idea is that you and game devs from all over the world and from all parts of the industry are getting on a train and jamming on your way to GDC. And I was there this year, and I remember on Train Jam, when you go to your meals, you're seated in fours. If you come with less than 4, you get seated with some randoms. And I showed up one day by myself and was seated with a couple random people. And the person sitting next to me was a Palestinian game developer, and he told me he was working on a political game. And I said, oh wow, coming from Palestine, you must feel really charged to make a political game. And he went off. He had stuff to say, all for valid reasons. And somewhere in there, when the speech started to get pretty critical of Israelis, again, for very valid reasons, I said, do you think all Israelis feel that way? And his response was essentially like, oh, I'm sure that Israelis are happy that blank and blank and blank. And I looked at him and I said, I'm Israeli and I don't feel that way. And you could see the white lady on the other side of the table just like, and like, as everyone could hear each other's chewing and forks were dropped and stuff like that. And I was like, no, we gotta do the thing. And he and I, we had such an incredibly powerful and sensitive and an emotionally laborious conversation, but we walked away from that table having made new friends, and we're still in touch now. And thank you, yeah. So, Rashid, this is for you. But I have found that especially for someone with a very complicated background as a Middle Eastern person who's both Arab and Israeli, video games has been the best opportunity for me to go through this minefield gently and meet people who were ready to like have me with open arms, and all the other Israeli and Arab devs that I've met, and then also to be one of them and then talk to people who are not from those communities and realize how to them, especially in the traveling game dev community, it seemed just so, like nobody blinked an eye about that. I'm not going to say like, oh yeah, all devs are because we know that there's a lot of toxicity in all communities really. I mean, it always finds its way in there one way or another. And so obviously not all game devs are like, this cool and liberal and with it or anything like that. But I have found that the trend, especially in indie, is that there are so many people who are at least trying to be progressive or forward and have at least heard of the ways in which other people would describe me as being radical. Whether it's because I'm, like a Nordic and Middle Eastern person, or an Arab and an Israeli, or a polyamorous dev, or someone who does this and this and this, and all these kinds of stuff. I've met so many people, or non-binary, that's another big one. I remember the first time I went to Train Jam, which was last year. I just want to say real quick was basically that I was like terrified to go on the train because I was going to have to be like, oh, what if people are going to keep mispronouncing me and all this kinds of stuff. Yo, Train Jam, more like Trans Jam. There were so many trans devs on this jam. I could not believe it. I have found so much love in the trans game community, in the like international games community, and it's just been like a soft pillow for me to land on, considering the racism that I regularly deal with in Helsinki. There's my answer. Thank you.
So the final goodbye to the audience, because it's time to close this panel. So your final say, your final say, your final say. Oh, it sounds so final. Countdown.
I don't have an awful lot else to add. I think we've covered a lot of ground, but I just want to say thank you very much for having me. I've had a fantastic time here, and it's been a really great conference.
Any wish for this awesome audience to do so you come next year to the conference and be amazed by what they do? Make challenging, interesting kind of games.
Yeah, keep on just kind of doing what you're doing and making excellent games, really. And Sweden I'm continually impressed by like the variety of games that sort of Sweden puts out. You know, everything from Goat Simulator to Vermintide. It is a pretty spectacular sort of spectrum, and I think that's this kind of that variety and that talent that helps create events like this that are just that have really strong themes and have really open, frank discussions.
I hope I will be back next year, but I hope that I will be able to do more than just essentially one day and one evening to play many more games. I always tell about this how the Sweden Game Arena and the games that are from this particular place, they are all very special, and they have their I don't want to say identity anymore. They have their certain flavor to them, as in, for example, there is a lot of production of narrative games specifically that I haven't seen like from one city even, especially like being Skövde, being that small, and that's it.
I definitely want to start by thanking you so much for having me on this panel, for Sweden Game Conference for accepting my talk and having me speak here, the panel that I did this morning, which I also loved very much, all the new friends that I've made, the incredible audience and all the great people I've had the chance to speak with over the past few days, and I definitely encourage you to come talk to me about anything, whether it's any of these marginal identities that I've discussed, or about careers in games, or about being a traveling game dev, or any of those things. I want so much to pass on what I know to as many people as I can possibly do it. I don't think that any of us have enough time to make all of the mistakes and learn from them, so let's learn from each other's and share our knowledge as best we can, and that's part of why I agreed to be here. So once again, thank you. Please come talk to me, and that's it.
Aw.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me here. This has been such an incredible honor to be able to share some of my story and some of my knowledge with all of you, and to be able to learn from you, to play your games, to enjoy this city with its really fun game culture. On a deeper note too, I mean, yes, I got a new position now after Telltale, which is amazing. But like I just started this week, you guys. I'm like barely doing anything yet. So I'm still very much in that headspace of like the most recent thing that happened to me with games was pretty traumatic for me and my entire community. And most of the time that I've been hanging out with former devs in the past month because of that, even though I have plenty of other dev friends in the San Francisco Bay Area, has been with other former Telltale devs. And we have a wonderful family atmosphere, but it's been kind of bleak, to be quite honest. And to be able to celebrate games, to meet new people, to make new friends, to talk about things with different perspectives than I've had in my little Telltale bubble for a while, it's made me really optimistic that this industry can change in some of the ways that I outlined in my talk. And I feel so much better about life after having been at this conference, so thanks.
Well, thanks for having me. It was a great pleasure and a great honor to be here and to speak with all of you. I've met some wonderful people here all around the conference, and the cake is a lie.
Is it? Oh no. Well, thank you for... And thank you everyone for